Tetelestai. It's the Greek word for "it is finished." This phrase is understood to be the last words of Jesus on the cross. But with these words holds a promise that our sin is paid for in full. But if we look around, we still live in a world that in many regards is dark, sinful, and produces suffering. So how then does Jesus' suffering on the cross bring an end to ours? For us to answer this question, we must look at what Jesus endured as he approached crucifixion and what he accomplished while on the cross. Let's start in Gethsemane. And they went to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." And he took with him Peter and James and John and began to be greatly distressed and troubled. And he said to them, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch." And going a little farther, he fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, that the hour might pass from him. And he said, "Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but you will." Before Jesus' last words on the cross, he's found in a place known as Gethsemane, which is understood to be the olive press. And under looming pressure of his betrayal, capture, trial, torture, and death, it's understood that in these moments, Jesus experienced so much stress that his body began to sweat blood. And it's in here in Gethsemane that Jesus begins to suffer for our sin, and Jesus, under the weight of it, continues to have his focus fixed on the Father's will, which is to bring an end to sin and death's grasp on mankind. And it's ironic that sin and suffering began in a garden with rebellion, and in a garden, the end of sin and suffering begins with submission. Jesus before the council. And they led Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes came together. And Peter had followed him at a distance right into the courtyard of the high priest. And he was sitting with the guards and warming himself at the fire. Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. For many bore false witness against him, but their testimony did not agree. And some stood up and bore false witness against him, saying, "We heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another one, not made with hands.' Yet even about this their testimony did not agree. And the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, 'Have you no answer to make? What is this that these men testify against you?' But he remained silent and made no answer. Again the high priest asked him, Are you the Christ, Son of the Blessed?' And Jesus said, 'I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven.' And the high priest tore his garments and said, 'What further witness do we need? You have heard this blasphemy. What is your decision?' And they all condemned him, deserving death. And some began to spit on him and to cover his face and to strike him, saying, 'Prophesy!' And the guards received him with blows. From being betrayed and abandoned by his friends to being captured in the middle of the night and tried with no defense in the early morning, one thing is clear: that Jesus endured unjust judgment to free us from God's judgment. As the prophet Isaiah declared concerning the Messiah, he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a sheep that is led to slaughter, like a sheep that is before its shears is silent, so he opened not his mouth. The crucifixion. Roman crucifixion was the perfected method to instill fear in and crush those who went against Rome's authority. It was a brutal humiliation that Jesus gave himself up to so that we would be free from sin. And this is pictured perfectly as a murderer known as Barabbas is freed while Jesus is set to be crucified in his place. So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas. And having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. And the soldiers led him away inside to the palace, and they called together the whole battalion. And they cloaked him in purple, and twisting together a crown of thorns they put onto him. And they began to salute him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they were striking his head with a reed and spitting on him and kneeling down in homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they stripped of him the purple cloak and put on his clothes, and they led him out to be crucified. And on the cross, Jesus would experience the darkness of man. With every breath came excruciating pain that opened the wounds on his back and applied immense pressure to the nerves within his hands and his feet. And on that cross, he was humiliated, mocked, and even by those who were being crucified against him. Yet despite this, Jesus did not waver from his focus that was fixed on the Father's will. What began in the garden would end on the cross. Which brings us back to the question we asked in the beginning. How does Jesus' suffering on the cross bring an end to ours? You see, Jesus' submission to the Father's will takes our place before God. He drinks the cup that we could not bear, and every drop of blood pays for every sin that has been committed. From Adam's rebellion to Judas' betrayal to our own sin, Jesus' sacrifice on the cross brings us back into relationship with a perfect God. It reconciles with him. And through the sin of one man, suffering was brought into the world. Like so, through the submission of one man, sin's grasp on the world would be loosened. And that's why Jesus' last words are tetelestai, it is finished. Because on that cross, our sin is paid for.